Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by visiting US Modernist's massive mid-century modern archives at usmodernist.org. Today's show is called Children of Genius, which needs some echo, featuring Emily Ain, daughter of architect Gregory Ain, and Randy Koenig, son of architect Pierre Koenig. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hello, folks. Our Frank King is on vacation. He's at sea, I believe, lobbying somewhere around the Caribbean. And it's great to have joining me as co-host Bob Langford, producer, reporter, newspaper columnist, and former modernist homeowner, all-around good guy. Bob recently shot a documentary in Palm Springs about US Modernist and our amazing gang of modernist fans, which is now in post-production. Welcome, Bob.
George, thanks. That was almost an accurate description, too. So thank you. No, really. Should I tell a story of how we met?
Sure.
In our travails?
Sure.
Okay, this is real quick, but real true. George and I knew each other. George comes over to my house. I'm standing in the driveway, and he says, "Get in the car. We're taking a ride." Okay. I had no idea where we were going, what we were doing.
Did he put you in the trunk?
No. He had a passenger seat and everything. So we're driving around Raleigh, North Carolina, looking at modernist homes. And George says, "I have not seen this one." And we stop the car in the driveway and we knock on the door. And George Smart, this is absolutely true, says, "Can we just look around your house for a minute?" These are just two guys. Back then we were in our 20s or something. And damn it, they didn't let us in. They let us just walk in the house and said, "This is the kitchen. This is the sunken living room." And we were there 20 minutes and said, "Thanks so much," and walked out. And those people still don't believe a word we said to them. So that's true. So I'm thrilled to be here on the podcast.
Well, like they say on Mythbusters, do not try this at home. Your typical homeowners will not be as receptive as they were in 2007.
Plus, we look like nice people.
Yes.
At least we did then. We'd both shaved. Anyway, let's get to some particulars. Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Sarah Sung of Mod Homes Realty. She is truly a lovely single lady who's into LL Cool J, Wagyu beef sushi, long Sunday walks along Central Park, technically not in Central Park, just along it, just in front of the plaza there, and pomegranate martinis. At least that's what it says on our Our Time profile. Sarah Sunk.
Thank you for waiting.
Who am I to step on the angels?
Really?
Also loves modernist houses as much as anybody listening to this does. And she's got the track record and the expertise to help you get the modernist house of your dreams. So you can reach her at modhomesrealty.com or 919-601-7339.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, man.
Gregory Ain traveled in some lofty architectural circles. He was inspired to become an architect after visiting Rudolf Schindler's Kings Road house in L.A. He lived in Richard Neutra's VDL Research House and worked for Neutra, as well as Harwell Hamilton Harris. Ain was chief engineer for Charles and Ray Eames in the development of their well-known and famous plywood chairs. As a result of a proposed housing project suspected of being communist by Senator McCarthy because it was racially integrated, Ain was investigated by the FBI over 30 years. He was the most dangerous architect in America, and this broad and inaccurate accusation caused the loss of many commissions, including his participation in the famous case study program. Ain left California and became dean of the Pennsylvania State University School of Architecture, and today his name is well known throughout Los Angeles and California, and his houses are highly prized examples of refined, timeless, modernist architecture. Our first guest is Ain's daughter, Emily Ain. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thank you.
I understand this is your first podcast?
And participating, yes. I've listened to podcasts, but
well,
yes.
You never forget your first time, Emily.
That's what they say.
Well, they're not always right. Architect Pierre Koenig graduated in 1952 from USC. He apprenticed in the offices of Raphael Soriano, Edward Fickett, Kirchner, Wright and Wright, and Quincy Jones. He established a private design practice in 1952 and became known for exposed steel and glass buildings, including the iconic and world-famous Stahl House, one of the very famous case study houses up in the hills up above Los Angeles. Koenig taught at the USC School of Architecture for 40 years and was named both Distinguished Alumni and Distinguished Professor at USC in 1998. His innovative steel buildings, they kind of hung onto cliff sides and masterfully defined gravity. We're joined by his son, attorney Randy Koenig, founder of Koenig Jacobson LLP, specializing in, of all things, the legal needs of design professionals. Welcome, Randy. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Good to be here.
Emily, let's start with you. Did you grow up in one of your dad's houses? What was that like?
Yeah, I did, up in Laurel Canyon, and I've been there, sort of recently. It's somewhat changed, but yeah, and but I didn't think anything of it. I mean, that was just what I knew. And there was a Schindler next door, which my best friend lived in, and the next door was about a half a block away. I mean, there weren't many houses up there in those days. So it was later, like when I was maybe in junior high, when somebody would come over and they'd see the house, a kid, friend, and they'd say, oh, it just seemed very different than the typical house. And of course, most of my parents' friends were modernists or, lived in modern homes. So that's, it didn't seem different. It was very nice and very open. The outside was easily accessible and easily, we were in and out a lot.
Did people seek you out? Did they drive by and look at the house?
No, not then, because the Willow Glen, the street we were on, was a dirt road, and there were very few houses up there. Now, Laurel Canyon has gotten some cachet. It was just, there were a lot of architects that lived up there. I mean, not necessarily, names that you would know. They sort of went into a different phase of architecture, but quite a few of our, my parents' friends were architects. But it was like we'd literally climb over a hill, a small little mountain, made paths like to go to another house of a friend on Woodstock, which is the street above our street. I don't think you'd see that in Los Angeles today. Let's put it that way.
Now, were you aware of the FBI surveillance?
No, and that's a very interesting story that I didn't know anything about that until very, very recently. And I have the papers. I got the FBI file, and it amazes me because Gregory was working with Eames down in Venice, and at night he'd come home and work on his private work, and they were following him, because it's in the papers. Now, of course, he must have known because it was not a paved road. There were no street lights, and it was very dark, very rural up there then. And, they'd follow him everywhere, and it's all, signed by S.A., which I guess is special agent, and then the name is whited out of who the agent was. But this is, it's almost 300 pages.
And how long ago was this?
Well, it's, in fact, one of the papers, which was signed by Hoover, says there's no need to follow this person, and and his signature is on it. Finally, and I think that was like the late 80s. Also they've got my name in it also, and my little brother's, because when we were born, they were following us at that point, and that was in the 40s. But my brother and I had no idea. And when I called my brother and told him, he said, no, I don't believe you. And I said, well, I've got it in front of me, the file. And I just started reading him.
Now, I read, Emily, that your babysitter was an FBI informant.
Well, no, I've talked about this with Chris, and there was a woman, because my mother was working and Gregory was working, and his practice had certainly died off at this point, who was sort of like, not really a housekeeper, but kind of like a babysitter, and maybe she did some housekeeping. And I can't believe, she was a little Irish woman, and I just can't believe that she, she might, and all I'm saying, because one of the papers says, she said that there were some very progressive materials in the house, and they name whatever the paper was. And I don't remember I don't remember now, but it wasn't like as
Communist Workers' Party Daily.
And as most of my parents' friends were, they were all like actor, in the creative fields, and those are just the people we grew up with, the kind of left-leaning. But it wasn't such a big, well, I don't know.
But your parents were not communists.
No, no. Well, according to the FBI papers, she joined later, but at some point, and Gregory was. But I don't, Gregory seems to me, I think he was really interested in the architecture because it could house multi-families, sort of progressive, decent-looking, I guess what you call apartment complexes.
Affordable housing. No wonder he was under government surveillance.
No, it's just, it really was. Both my parents were very, neither one of them grew up with any money. My mother came here as an Armenian refugee during the Armenian genocide. So both of them had, kind of rough upbringings. Gregory not so much because his parents were married, stayed married. But anyway, I remember when my parents split up, we moved to New York with my mother, and my father wrote to us. And I remember there was this letter that he wrote, and it was what he called a picture letter. And for Dear Emily, it was the head of a deer. He drew it, a picture, and then MLE for Emily, which is what he always, when he was writing to me, he would always say, Dear Emily, MLE. And the whole letter was all these little pictures, and I kept thinking, I wonder where that letter is, because I knew my mother had saved it. And I thought maybe it's in the old trunk that I was using as a coffee table for 20 years. And I opened it up, and I found these letters that Gregory had written to my mother when she was in New York modeling at the Art Students League in the 1930s. Well, then I found all these other letters of other people in theater and in art that knew my mother from back then. So I put together this story that's amazing. She used to say, I've got to throw away the stuff in the trunk. I had no idea what she was talking about.
Randy, how you doing? Thanks for being with us.
I was so fascinated listening to Emily. I didn't even know I was on the show. Is it my turn now?
Yes. Let me ask you, did you grow up in one of your dad's houses?
Well, I'm just fascinated by listening to Emily and comparing and contrasting my life experience. And actually, it does validate George's theme of children of architects. I found it fascinating.
Well, yes, and I want to meet you, too, sometime.
I look forward to that. But very, very different, very interesting. Ironically, I was born in Koenig House number 1. In Glendale.
Wow.
And people don't know this. There's not a lot of information about my dad prior to like 1990, the 80s. A lot of research, and I agree with you, Emily. I mean, I'm not a trained architect, and there's been plenty of books written on my dad's from a technical standpoint. But I find that from the person's side, the experience is very interesting. And I was born in Koenig House number 1. Bethlehem Steel gave him a grant for $10,000. He built the house.
No kidding.
It was experimental with the steel, post-World War II experimental metals. And USC, he was a grad student there and was teaching some. And I was not born yet. At the end of the street up by the cul-de-sac, my dad was building his house and met my mother, who was living with my grandparents at the end of the street, and she was a freshman at USC. My first memories were at the house, although I was very, very young. And my dad sold it, and they divorced when I was very young. I mean, like 2-3 years old. And so I did live in that house that my dad built, and I'm actually in my office. I have some pictures. Our family archives are at the Getty, and there's one picture, one of my favorites, of my dad at a drafting table in Koenig number 1, and he's like 25 years old. It's pretty incredible.
Randy, did you have any experiences or almost epiphanies where, people came to your house, or you just looked around and said, this is not like my friend's house?
I thought about that. I have to tell you something. When you're young, you're a kid, you don't realize what's happening. But let me give you an example. This is the early 60s. And it was before the 60s movement. We're talking about liberalism, Vietnam War. All the professors, architects, my dad, very, very liberal. And even a conservative university is still liberal today, so that's not saying much. But at my dad's house in the living room, you never knew who would come over, and they'd have these intellectual discussions to all hours of the night, and they partied, they smoked, they drank, and you never knew what was going to happen the next morning. I was thinking about that. I woke up one morning on a Saturday morning, and in the living room there was like 35 pieces from an Egyptian tomb. They're bones, mummies.
Wow. That weren't there the night before?
They were not there the night before, and I'm waking up, and I'm going through all this stuff. Coins, and my dad it was an incredible time. If you look at the USC School of Architecture, the roster of young architects in the late 50s, early 60s, I mean, it's a who's who. And these guys, I can't even remember all their names, were here and there, and it was incredible. And only now do I realize that and appreciate it. What kind of rubbed off.
Cool.
Well, Emily, I wanted to ask you, we did a little research. Our researcher, Cindy Stratton, not her real name, has done a little digging into, what might have got the FBI's attention. And as far as we could tell, it seemed like that there was a housing development that was brokered not by real estate developers, but by musicians originally, that was going to be a standard housing development for people in the entertainment industry. Plus, for the first time in that area, it was going to be racially integrated. And that seemed to trip the attention of our Justice Department. Is that how you know it?
Yeah. I don't know if it was that, but yes, that is definitely true. And Gregory was, and this would have been much later on, he built an office in Silver Lake, and that was where he worked independently. And the guy that rented the other half of the office was also an architect, a black guy, and they were friends. And, Gregory I think that my parents really didn't see color. It was just people if they found them intellectually challenging. Both of my parents were like that. And I don't think of Los Angeles as being that segregated as a kid, but it's true that in those days it was, I guess, pretty white. Certainly most of the people that we dealt with. And I think the thing is what's really interesting, because it's so scandalous today to think that your father was a communist. But, I was probably 60 years old when I found out. It was certainly not a part of either my brother's or my life. Certainly, obviously, Gregory knew it impacted his life, but we were never told anything about it. So,
for those of you that are now Googling the name of the black architect who shared office space with Gregory
Jimmy
Ain,
Garrett. Yeah, I could have told you that.
There you go.
Yeah.
Randy, your dad hung out with a bunch of interesting architecture in that time. I think he had met Gregory Ain a few times, and also you had mentioned to me when we talked earlier that he did some things with Richard Neutra.
Yeah, kind of a cute anecdotal story, and Emily was mentioning letters that she found. Neutra really wanted to hire my dad to be an architect in his office, and he would call all the time. He'd come over to the house, and my dad reminded me that I had a little relationship with Richard Neutra, and he would write me letters imploring me to become an architect. I have not seen those letters, although I do remember Richard Neutra very well, and he scared the holy crap out of me. He was a very tall man, big bushy eyelashes, and I was a little kid, and apparently I had a relationship with him. I remember him very well, but I think I wanted to hide behind my dad. That's what I wanted to do. I remember Neutra very well, coming over to the Dorothy Street house and talking to him and talking to him on the phone. My dad worked in the studio in the back, and my dad raised me. My mom was not around, and because of that, I had the luxury of my dad chauffeuring me around to all these famous houses. And I was inseparable from him. And you mentioned, case study. My dad was great friends with all the owners. They were all smart, intellectual people, pushed the envelope, and I had relationships with all of them. My favorite house was 21. That was
Case Study House 21?
Yes, Case Study. And Walter Bailey. People don't know this. Walter Bailey was a psychologist, a professor at UCLA, and a very large African-American football player type. And I spent every Saturday over there learning about football from him. And we became great friends. My dad and his family, we became great friends and went over there quite a bit. And that was my favorite house. And I visited it several times in the last 20 years, and followed it's what's going on with that house.
But as far as you know, the FBI was not following your dad around.
No, but not to my knowledge. But I will tell you the collection of leftist intellectuals in my life is remarkable. Where I grew up, which was in Brentwood, which was kind of the epicenter of the 60s and 70s, where San Vicente and Wilshire collide, almost by UCLA. There was so much going on right in that area, from protests and music and culture and architecture, and there's so many movie stars. It's kind of funny. I was reflecting on some things. You guys know who Ray Cappy is, of course, right?
Sure.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So his daughter, Karen Cappy, from elementary school, junior high to high school, you had to sit in alphabetical order. So you had Ray Cappy's daughter sitting right in front of me for 12 years, and you had the Eames down the street. Venice. There's a USC. It's just part of my life. Even though I became a lawyer, the Perry Mason reruns got to me, and I wanted to carve my own path. For all you historians of that, I actually found the Perry Mason courtroom. It's actually in San Pedro. It's still intact, and I had the judge let me have a court hearing there. It's still there. It was a police station jail turned into a courthouse, and it's a historic place now, right?
Oh, cool.
San Pedro, if you were ever interested. And my dad was very upset that I did not become an architect, okay? And that was a tension that I always had to live with. But I was very, very close to my dad. I have incredible memories and experiences that I, too, think that maybe I'll write a book someday.
Well, Randy, your DNA has not let you stray too far. I mean, you are helping protect architects throughout California.
Yes, and I represent Frank Gehry, for example, and he goes, well, Randy, how do you like the practice of architecture working for your famous father? And I said, I don't. I became a lawyer. He recoiled and said I probably made the right decision. But anyway, I didn't plan it this way. It's the way it worked out, and I'm still very involved with the USC School of Architecture. I'm on the board of counselors and I represent architects, and gosh knows they need it all over the state. And that's my story.
Emily, all this talk of Perry Mason segues perfectly into our next question. So, your dad, he designed this house for the Museum of Modern Art back when architects could do that in the garden. And it's no longer with us. What is the mystery?
Yeah.
It disappeared somewhere.
Where did it go?
Yeah.
And what happened to it? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Well, interesting with that recent thing that was in the New York Times about that house. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, in general, yes.
Right.
We're just trying to follow up what's happened in terms of the search for this mystery prototype house that got built in the museum and then disassembled and vanished.
For lack of a better term,
yeah. Well, I have no idea. I mean, I've got letters that Gregory wrote home from when he went to the museum opening. He wrote them to my mother because she didn't go. We didn't have enough money for her to go to the opening. And, he talks about, he went and spent a weekend at Philip Johnson's place. It's very funny comments that he made. But I never obviously went to the house, and it doesn't seem like anybody knows what happened to it. But I did contact the guy that wrote that article in the New York Times, and of course, right away he says to me, gee, if I'd known you existed, I would have contacted you about this article. And I thought, well, I guess he didn't do much research. But anyway.
Yeah, he doesn't have a Cindy Stratton around to try to dig these things up.
Yeah, okay. We talked for quite a while, and he's 26 years old or something. And, no, wait, there was a point of it. But I don't know, I don't know what happened to it. Certainly I do vaguely remember when he went, that was 1950, when he went to New York, and then it was, I believe, and then it was right after that my parents got a divorce. So, and we lived with my mother. So,
well, we want to announce the first of our US Modernist Radio challenges. We will pay the sum of $100 to anybody with direct evidence of what happened to this house.
Oh, okay.
You can claim this reward by contacting us at usmodernist.org.
One of the criticisms of that house was that they had communist art in it, and they had just, Gregory, I don't know if Gregory picked it or what, they just taken paintings from the museum and, modern paintings to put on the walls in the house. It wasn't like Gregory had gone digging up communists to get, what they might doodle in art, like Murrow's and things like that.
And somebody saw that and thought it was just communist paintings, like from the Daily Worker offices or something?
No. I think they knew, who the artists were, but they were probably lefties to a certain extent too. I have to say, I feel like, well, other than being a communist, I feel like there wasn't such a discrepancy in whether you were Republican or Democrat or whatever in those days, but I guess there was. But nowadays, it's a real brand.
Well, we'll have to cover that in our PBS version of the show.
Okay.
All right.
George, you gave me the perfect segue into what happened to Koenig House number 1.
Perfect. Go ahead.
I will I'll give you guys $250 if you can provide information leading to the recovery and discovery of what happened to Koenig House number 1. I have my interest peaked during my entire life. We knew that, and Emily may know this, the Glendale Freeway number 2. It actually caused the Koenig number 1 to be disassembled and is no longer there. I went a couple of years ago and tried to find it myself. I found the lot where it was, but nothing's there. It's all overgrown brush, and the freeway's not far off. Somebody disassembled it. I don't know what happened to it. It might be interesting. Maybe it's melted down.
Well, that's interesting, yeah.
Now we have 2 rewards for mystery houses across the country.
Theoretically, there's $350 for somebody.
Yeah.
Well, with this podcast, if it gets around, you never know.
Yeah. I'm missing a couple of socks.
But Randy, where do you live?
Actually, I live in Laguna Beach. I grew up on the west side there with everything going on, and it's just LA's just a little too much for me. I can drive up there in an hour, and I'm fine. George, I listened to the Stall House, your episode. That was the one I listened to last night. Fascinating stuff. It's interesting because the people talking about it were not there.
Here's your cue, Randy. Take it away.
Someday we got to talk about that, George.
Well, today's the day because Bob has a question for you.
So we can't let you out of here without discussing the Stall House. I mean, it couldn't be built, yet there it is. So from your perspective, how did it come to be?
Well, my dad was, just the hottest architect going on at that time. And I was just a kid, be with a babysitter, and he'd be doing, most of us work for a living, but daytime TV, all the talk shows, my dad was always saw him on TV. It wasn't a big deal. And he had that opportunity, and my dad really had to be motivated by the lots, the property, the whole situation, the challenges. If he had the architectural freedom to do what he wanted to do, very, very important to my dad. and this was a challenging project. And if you guys, I'm sure you don't know his architecture. I mean, there wasn't an unbuildable lot. It's just a question of how much engineering you wanted to spend, and that's how that came to fruition. And in the last few years, there's been some discussion about the origin of that house and all that. It was a bunch of nonsense, and I can clarify that at some time, but not just beyond the scope of this. But a great house, great people. I've been up there many times throughout my whole life, and that was my dad's favorite house. And my first memory was my dad had a 1954 MGTD red, and he drove me around everywhere. And I was up there as a little kid for the shoot, the famous Julia Shulman shoot, with the two ladies dressed beautifully in evening gowns on the part of the building that's overhanging the cliff with the globe light. It's the quintessential photograph of modern architecture, and I was there for that whole thing, and I had to sit in the car, so I still remember that.
Well, so what are the misconceptions floating around? What do you want to clear up?
The LA Times wrote an article, I don't know if you saw this, Emily, I don't know, 7 years ago, how Buck Stahl is taking credit for the design of that house. And my dad had very little to do with the design.
Oh, you're kidding. No, and I get to see the LA Times all the time. Oh, you're
very upset the family very much. And just preposterous. And actually, I had to go up. Actually, there's a whole history to this house right now. There's some things going on, and I have to check on it and see what's going on up there. But they do the tours, and I went on the tour. And it was interesting how they presented the architecture, and still they have docents up there. And there's a little confusion as to who the architect was on that house, which is just preposterous. And I don't ascribe to that at all.
Are they saying it's someone besides your dad?
No, Buck Stahl. Okay. It's all him. He designed it. He designed it. He's all
that's
his
the
vision.
Client.
Right. Yeah, that's the client.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
unbelievable.
The time.
Well, and with a name like Koenig, that's just incredible that anybody had the nerve.
It got a little traction with the Times, and every. This is what I told the family. Every owner of a custom house thinks they designed the house. It's their vision, and the caliber of architects we're talking about in this show are having incredible strong will. Their integrity to the design, everything. It's so much more, but it's very common for the owner to think they designed their house, and if the architect does the right thing, they carry out, they implement the vision. The architect designs the instruments of service, their intellectual property. That's what they provide, and that's a different thing. And sometimes owners confuse that, but I think it's all good. But clearly, my dad designed the house. It was his vision. If you look, the materials, the layout, the whole thing. It was a very important house, and my dad's favorite house out of all of them.
I think it's a lot of people's, not even connected with architecture, their favorite house. It looks wonderful.
When I go lecture around the country, I in architecture law. Sometimes the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation is in the audience, and they always come up to me, and it's happened on several occasions, and congratulate me and say my dad's house is the most famous house in the world, more photographed, more movies, more than Falling Water, and they're very, very gracious about it. And
well, that's nice. Yeah,
it's kind of a cool little thing.
Well, I want to thank you both for being on the show today. It's been fabulous talking with each of you and getting to know you a little bit. You really do your dads proud. Thank you for being with us.
Okay.
Thank you, George.
Yes, and
thank you both so much.
Very much. And nice to meet you, Randy.
You can hear us smiling.
And thank you, Emily. We'll talk later.
And to everybody out there, thanks again for listening. This has been great fun for me. George, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sunk, your real estate angel for modernist houses. But she has a very earthly phone number, 919 601-7339. All right, take us home, Tom.
Visit USModernist.org for more information about today's guests. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Cindy Stratton, not a real name, researches our guest from a secret underground bunker. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile, the most dangerous engineer in podcasts.
Yes.
It says here.
I'm frightened.
George and Bob and I will be back in 2 weeks with another Red Scary edition of US Modernist Radio, people.